So if you're like me, you have no idea still what type of job you ultimately want to end up with for the rest of your life, or just in general, depending on the sector or where you're in. So this video is going to be probably the most useful for people that are literally just starting out at the beginning of their career. So let's say you're graduating college and you're just starting like your first year or two of job experience. Or you graduated high school, you're going to college early, and then you're also just starting out, like let's say like you took a teaching assistant job because you were lucky enough to get one and stuff like that. So this video is going to be kind of an overview of the different sectors out there that offer employment, depending on like your skill set, your interests, where you want to go. It's obviously reflective of my own experience, being with 3 to 4 years of job experience so far, 28 years old, and working in the environmental science sector, at least for now. And so this video is meant to kind of give younger people than me an understanding of like the various sectors, the pros and cons, and whether or not you honestly want to end up in any one of these. So the first will be the public sector, because that is currently what I am doing right now. And so what do I mean by public sector? So public sector means government. And so when you talk about government, typically here in the United States or any other country, that refers to working for the federal government, but it could also refer to working for your state government or your local government. So it could be city, state, federal, whatever. It honestly doesn't matter. It's kind of, from what I've understood with other colleagues of mine that work at the state level and at the local city council level for like your local, like let's say county or something like that, they fulfill the same role of public service, which is meant to better an area for people through various means with different services that each level provides. Obviously, the higher up you go, from local to state to federal, the scope of your responsibilities will obviously differ drastically. Like I work, for example, on policy that pretty much affects the whole nation. That doesn't make me any important though compared to the local city council person that runs their own city or their county, and that ultimately influences people's lives at the same time. That's what public service means at the end of the day. And so when it comes to just the public sector in general, so a couple of pros. So the first thing is that typically a lot of public sector jobs, like the one that I have right now, have the standard 40-hour work week and have a good work-life balance in comparison to the private sector, nonprofits, and others. I know that's going to vary across your industry, and before I get called out on that, I just want to make that clear that this is reflective of my own industry. I am well aware of many different people telling me that public sector jobs are kind of a nightmare sometimes because of their workload and their area. Like if you work, for example, in the defense industry, or if you work in the State Department, sometimes you're pulling 60 to 70 hour work weeks because you have no choice. You have to, because the workload is that big. Typically though, just in general, on average, just know that for public sector jobs, one of the big pros is the work-life balance, depending on which agency you choose if you're in the United States. I can't comment on other foreign nations like France, for example, because I've just never worked there before. So that's one of the pros why I chose my job right now, is because of the fact that the 40-hour work week is respected and ultimately held to, because people have lives out of work. I have hobbies like this that I'm doing and stuff like that, and ultimately that's not possible if the 40-hour work week isn't respected, depending on where you work. So there are times obviously where you pull extra weight, but it's encouraged not to, depending on your agency and where you work at. So that's one of the pros of a public sector job. And so some of the cons that go along with that, for example, your salary isn't as high as obviously the private sector, because private sector people are typically paid more, like for example consulting. Public sector jobs, until you hit a certain level, they can be very difficult to live with, let's say if you want to live alone, like I do, and stuff like that. Unless you have money saved up and you're just starting out in the federal, state, or local city council government, it can be very difficult to live on your own if you want to do that. So typically, a lot of entry-level public service jobs are well known for not being paid well, even though they offer great benefits and stuff like that, which I'll also get into. So just know that, like, if you're just starting out in the public sector, the pay isn't that good. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, there is something called COLA, which is cost of living adjustment for short, and depending on where you live in the United States, just search it up online. COLA, cost of living adjustment. Different areas have different rates of increase depending on how high the standard of living is. Like, for example, I can tell you that DC, it's like 28% or something like that. It's high, but it's not as high as, for example, like California or Hawaii, or, you know what I mean, like states where it is very expensive to live in, and you have to have either money saved up or you gotta have 6 roommates in the same house. Otherwise, good luck. You might want to be living in a box under a bridge. It's a number exaggeration. So that's one of the cons about working in the public sector, is that it can potentially be very difficult to start off with. But once you get to a certain point, especially with a COLA adjustment, and then on top of that, in the public sector, so for example, in the private sector, right? Uh, it's well known that like wages across the board, no matter what sector you are, they do not keep up with inflation, and they have not substantially increased because companies like to make money. And unfortunately, the US is broke, dead broke, with the amount of national debt that we have. And I know those two are loosely related, but my point is that wages across the board increase, but not to what we need it to be to honestly make, a good living and stuff like that. So in the public sector, at least we get a certain increase every year. I know in the federal government, depending on the administration, you get like, I think this year it was like 5% or something like that. It's the biggest that like it's ever been, I think, across the board, which is great because like we need that for the work that we do, and also because you want to live in the public sector. So you have the cost of living adjustment, you have the rate of increase every year and stuff like that, which is great. And so those are, that's what comes along with working in the public sector, but you still won't make like a lot compared to like your private sector counterparts. So for example, I go on Reddit a lot, and I browse through the Fed News subreddit for federal employees, which is very useful for anyone that works there, by the way. I would highly recommend that you spend some time going through it, because like every now and then there's a gold nugget that you'll see, like, oh, I didn't actually know that about like my retirement plan or my health insurance or whatever. And so what's great about Fed News is that I discovered this like argument that was like kind of being like written in like the threads about how, like, for example, in the federal government, let's say like you live in DC like I do, right? Let's say like you're a GS like 13, 14. So for those of you who don't know, the general service scale, I believe it's called, goes up from like, I think it starts as low as 1, which is like a barely paid intern, all the way to like 15 before it like jumps to, let's say, like management or something like that. And then I was reading these very interesting stats that for people that are like GS 13, 14, they make like 6 figures, because that's what happens when you get to that level, and it's good money depending on like where you work and the responsibilities that you have. However, at the same time, a lot of people were saying that their GS 13 and GS 14 counterparts in the private sector make like 3 times the amount because of their expertise and their skill set and their years of accumulated job experience. It's very interesting to compare. So that's one major con, is that you're not going to make a lot, or you're not going to make as much compared to your private sector counterparts. But on the flip side, with the benefits such as work-life balance, if I really believe in that for any job. Like, I fiercely divide like ask anyone that I work with, I fiercely divide like my work from like my other hobbies and stuff like that. And then what goes along with like a great public service job is, for example, the benefits. Like, for example, after 20 years of federal service, you get a pension. See, that's one thing that a lot of people don't consider, or like they hear about it and they're just like, great, you know what I mean? Like, who can live off a pension anyway? So that's kind of to be debated a little bit, but you get that though after 20 years. That's the catch. So you have, the retirement plan with the pension. You have great, wouldn't call it great necessarily, but you have appropriate health insurance, dental insurance, vision insurance, all that great stuff. insurance just in general is a racketeering game, and I don't really think like you can win at any single level unless you want to pay like, you know, premiums that are like thousands of dollars. But anyway, so on the pro side, you have life work balance, you have great benefits, you have a pension potentially if you sink 20 years of your life into it. But on the con side, you don't make as much money. And that depends on what you're looking for in a job. Is it like the amount of money that you can earn per capita or GDP, right? Or does work-life balance matter to you? Does remote working matter to you? Does a great supervisor, all this stuff you should think about when you're kind of looking at these different sectors and various modes of employment. So that's the public sector. We'll move on to the private sector because I've done a little bit of that. So what do you mean by private sector? Great question. So what I mean by that is consulting. And so if you search up any meme about consulting, there's typically like the big four companies that pop up, like KPMG. What's another big one that like I constantly see on the news? Of course, I can't remember off the top of my head when I'm recording a YouTube video, but you get the idea. There's like the big four companies. Oh, Deloitte. Yeah. Deloitte, KPMG, etc. And those consulting firms are called the big four for a reason because they hire the most people, but it's a churn and burn. And what I mean by that is these firms are well known for hiring people straight out of college for, typically higher rates, like, for example, from what I remember seeing, like you could make like 70 to 80 depending on like where you work straight out of college if you have the right degree. Just saying, do your research. But the thing is that the churn and burn refers to the fact that they work you to the bone. I'm not even exaggerating. I have friends that have worked in Deloitte, KPMG, these big four consulting firms, and they pull 80 to like, 60 to 80 work weeks, 60 to 80 hour work weeks, which is insane. Like that is no sustainable life. And then you keep on maintaining that workload as you like go up in this company. So like I was reading this one post on like our consulting. You'll see a common trend where I go on a lot of Reddit threads. Please don't judge. But there was this senior partner who was anonymous at like one of the branches somewhere in the US. I think it was Deloitte or something. Watch Deloitte sue my ass for saying something like this. But he was saying that he gave 15 years of his life, 20 years of his life to become a senior partner. And it was like the first thing that he had wanted to do when he started working was like, I'm gonna be a senior partner, I'm gonna make that bread, I'm gonna make that money. And what he traded was completely priceless, because obviously with any job that you have, you're trading your time for money. That's how the whole economic system works. And so he had been working 50 to 80 hour work weeks for like his entire like tenure for his career, maybe less as he like, grew more prominent in like the branch and all that good stuff. But the man had reflected that I had worked so hard and so much to get a paycheck that was like really great for what it was. It was like 6+ figures, but like we're talking like big money. Senior partner, like probably maybe 7-figure territory or whatever, but like the cost was ungodly. Like he had aged, like the man was like young. Like he said in his post that he was in his like 40s. That's young, man. Like I'm 28 and like that's young, you know what I mean? And like he had looked like he was like 60 or something like that. So that's just something that you got to be aware of. So like in the private sector, the pro is, the money is great depending on where you work. The con is that compared to the public sector, they will work you to the bone, literally. Like they will drain the soul out of you. And like unfortunately, there's this churn and burn tactic with like a bunch of new, and I don't want to hear comments about like the younger generation is too lazy, okay? Like I hear that all the time, and like, how about you pay us a livable wage, and then we'll talk about that later. But anyway, don't even get me started on that. But it's just like I react with horror at like these stories that I read on like our consulting and like other news, where it's just like these people that are coming out of college like make great money, good for them, and at the end of the day they're working 60 to 80-hour work weeks, and then they wonder why they're depressed and miserable for the rest of their lives. So I'm not saying that all consulting is like that. I worked a consulting job myself for about a year, and then I ran away to grad school because I just didn't like the area that I was working in. But the workload was manageable, and there are weeks where it's more than, it's more than you can handle, and you got to put in the extra time. That's how it works. But that's like the private sector kind of in a nutshell with consulting. It's like you can make a lot of good money. You end up working way more compared to your public sector counterparts unless you find one of those jobs where you get paid $100K to just send an email all day. Let me know where that is, by the way. So that's the private sector. We covered private, public. We'll go into nonprofit. So the thing about the nonprofit world is this. A lot of nonprofits, in fact the majority, unless they have like a permanent source of funding from like philanthropists or whatever, every aspect of your work that you do is grant dependent. And that is a critical weakness because they are always constantly searching for the next grant to fund their operations. And so nonprofits, I'm biased because like I used to work for a nonprofit too actually, and then they were not so great experiences. It was noble work. Like that's one of the pros right there, is that the nonprofit work is charitable, it's noble work, it's very important to do, but there's a lot of cons that go a lot with that. So for example, you don't get paid a lot, and we're talking even less than your public sector counterparts, which arguably should make more, but they don't. That's one big thing. The second is that the workload capacity is similar to the private sector in the sense where you are constantly doing the job of 5 people, depending on the size of the NGO, nonprofit, non-governmental organization / nonprofit. I was working at a very small nonprofit twice, and you have to pull your weight around, you have to do the work of 3 people. I was not a big fan of that because, I'm not being paid what I'm worth, and, I'm essentially working for free in a couple ways. So in the nonprofit world, you have to be careful because like you can get burnt out very quickly. A lot of nonprofits are also very grant dependent, as we talked about as well. So like sometimes they will run out of money for your position, and you'll get unemployment and stuff, but unfortunately you might get laid off if the nonprofit decides to shut down because they can't continue to either fund staff or fund their operations. So something to consider as well. But it's charitable work, and for those of you who are just starting out, I would encourage you to work at a nonprofit to see what it's like, because you'll learn if you like it or not. I've had colleagues and friends of mine that loved working at nonprofits, and they still do. And if you work at the bigger nonprofits, they pay you more because they can afford to. And their work is often larger in scope, they can afford to hire more staff, and that's how it works. But if you work at a smaller nonprofit, again, you run the risk of being overworked, you don't get paid as much, in fact, hardly at all, and you have to be very careful about that. So just consider the size of the NGO / nonprofit if you're going that route. And again, I'm not burning like NGOs or nonprofits, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that from my own experience, it's been, a little bit negative with both of those experiences. But who knows, if I decided to work for like a bigger nonprofit in the environmental science sector, that could be amazing. You never know. I know a couple people that do that right now. So that's the nonprofit world. And then finally, there are other sectors, by the way, like I'm just kind of covering a couple just for those that are curious, but there's also the freelancing route. So I've done freelancing before, and freelancing isn't your typical 9-to-5 stuff. In fact, you're pretty much your own boss. And so that could be literally anything. You could be a freelance videographer, you could be a freelance writer, you could be a freelance whatever, depending on your skill set, your interests, and your experience. But the thing is that the world of freelancing it's difficult. Like I tried it for a while I was a freelance writer, I believe, because I was curious. Like I love writing and sometimes I like to write. And I was always curious about like what the whole, because on YouTube it's over glorified. It's like be your own boss, like be a freelancer, like set your own rates. Yeah, except for the fact that like literally everyone else has the same idea and they also want to be a freelancer because they just don't want to go, work for like somebody and work for themselves. Yeah, if you have zero experience freelancing, you're not gonna, like, let's say for example you're a freelance writer, right? And you get commissioned to write for, I don't know, let's say like a travel magazine like The Lonely Planet, right? Typically your, like, you can set your rates as high as you want to, but a lot of the freelance work that's out there, depending on like which industry and service you're in, is also highly dependent on the budget of companies that you want to work with. So like for example, if my rate is like $200 an hour to write an article, or it's, we typically charge per word. So let's say, from what I saw, like a good rate would be like, you know, $1.50 per word, which is like even higher than what it should be. But it's like, if my rate was like, let's say $4 a word, that's completely unsustainable. Like no one can afford to hire you to write like a 2,000 word article on the top 10 destinations in Costa Rica. That would never happen unless you're really good at what you do. But even then, it's like, you know, certain places have certain budgets. So all of this to say that the world of freelancing is incredibly competitive. You have websites out there like, for example, Fiverr, Upwork. If you don't know what those are typically people that are freelancers, right? And then they create an account, they advertise their services to potential clients that like want to design a website or want to write an article, right? And then they will post their rates and then essentially compete. Like it's a whole bidding process for like, you know, jobs. And so like there's this whole thing about like, you know, oh, play the game, play Upwork, right? Like find the person with the lowest rate and like, you know, try to get them to do the most work, and then they spit out like, you know, a really bad product, and you're just like, well, I should have, you know, you get what you pay for. So the world of freelancing is incredibly difficult. And unless you have money saved up, or unless you're well versed in like the area of freelancing as well, I would highly encourage you to maybe start it out as a side hustle to see if, like, let's say you're a great writer or you're a great videographer. Why don't you start finding clients that you can charge an X amount per hour for? See if the freelancing lifestyle appeals to you instead of just jumping right in. I had a friend that like literally was like, he was really good at what he did. He like edited videos for like, he edited YouTube videos for a living, and the guy was working a typical 9 to 5 job, and then he was doing that on the side. And he was like, you know what? I'm sick of my 9 to 5 job. I'm going to like, you know, I'm gonna go all in on myself. I'm gonna like do my like videographer like agency. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that. And he quit his job, and then he went all in without fully realizing that it's a very competitive world out there. There are like, there's always going to be someone better than you, and there's always going to be someone worse than you compared to what you do. You know what I mean? So like as soon as he entered like the freelancing world, his like one client that he was constantly like getting like jobs through because it was a friend of his, he quickly found out that was not enough to pay all of his bills that his 9 to 5 was covering. So what ended up happening was he ended up going back to that 9 to 5 because he realized that he had to revamp his whole strategy of what he offered to potential clients. He had to hire like a virtual assistant to handle like the outreach part of it, because that's also a big thing with like freelancing work, is like you're constantly working, but you're also relying on inbound clients to like give you bids. So like, hey, I want you to work on like X project for Y amount. So that's something that people don't realize with freelancing, is that it's incredibly competitive. If there's a YouTube video telling you to become a freelance writer and how to teach you to do, you know, 6 figures in a month, trust me, everyone's thinking the same thing. And so I caution you, take the less risky approach, if that's the right way to describe it, and start it off as a side hustle to see if you even enjoy that type of life. If you're making 6 figures after a couple of attempts, go ahead and quit your 9 to 5. By all means, do it. You know what I mean? But like at the same time, I try to play it safe with like, especially with like job security and like jobs and stuff like that, as much as I can. So like play it safe, try to see if like the freelancing lifestyle is like, you know, for you, and then see where that takes you. So we covered 4 sectors. We covered public, private, nonprofit, and freelance. And again, these sectors have various pros and cons depending on your interest, your skill set, your job experience, and ultimately what you want out of a job. And so I'm gonna end this video with this question. What matters the most to you in a job? Because that is something that I constantly have to ask myself no matter what I do. Is it, for example, like I talked to a bunch of people with informational interviews about like other sectors, other ways of work, and the responses differ, right? It's like some people say that the best thing in a job is your manager because your manager can make your life utter misery if you don't get along. So that's one thing. Is it the pay, for example, where money is everything to you, so consulting might actually be for you if you're willing to put in the work? Is remote work something that's important to you? Because a lot of places now, we're out of schmovid. I can't say it out loud. Otherwise, YouTube would never upload the video, or I think. But a lot of places don't do full remote anymore, and various companies are transitioning to a more hybrid approach, which is great because I'm a person that values in-person conversations and stuff like that. But I still like full remote too. That's not bad. You know what I mean? If you have other stuff that'll work, people know. But the thing is that like you also have to ask yourself, like, do you want to be doing that 2-hour commute? Like, for example, I had a friend in California when I was living there that drove 2 hours to his job, back and forth, every single day, 5 days a week, even working on the weekends. Guy was miserable because he would spend as much time in his job as he would driving to his job. And so eventually the guy got so depressed that he quit. And he was wondering where this like misery and sadness was coming from. And that's exactly like where it is. So you have to factor that in. Like now that the whole thing is like over, if you know what I mean, like from a couple of years ago, like companies and institutions are like very weary at the power of remote work. And we'll talk about this in a separate video because obviously there's pros and cons to full remote, hybrid, and full in person. And it's good that they're scared because they realize the power that we have as employees and not as employers over employees. Sadly, unfortunately, we lost a lot of that advantage with a lot of layoffs that have been happening in 2023 and 2024. A lot of that's in the tech industry, but that's spreading. So you have to consider that as well. So how much you get paid, is your manager a good fit for you? Remote work versus hybrid versus in person. Another big thing is the type of work that you do. Like, for example, I can definitely tell you that I've had people that have like come to me and they ask me like, the work is so unfulfilling and I am so bored. I am just so damn bored in my job with what I do. I can't do it anymore. And then they quit and then they did like a 1-year sabbatical. But you have to ask yourself, like, does the work resonate with your personality and then also your goals in life? Like, I can definitely tell you this. I have worked many jobs in my short life as a 28-year-old man that I did not enjoy. And the only reason why I did it was because of the fact that I needed a roof over my head and I just had to do it to survive. Unfortunately, that's the reality for like 99% of the people out there in the world today. Watching this video, maybe it's less, who knows, but like a lot of people hate their jobs. And you can say all you want, like quit your job, do your own thing, be your own boss. It's not that simple. If you have a family, you're not just going to quit your job and trade job security for something else. But at the same time, there's a tipping point with your happiness compared to your job security. Something to think about as well. So you have to ask yourself all of these questions like, what do you value the most out of a job? Ask yourself that and let that influence what type of work you want to do, which sector you want to go in, and then ultimately, what do you want to be, because you are spending your time. Like, time, like aside from, as cliche as it sounds, money is one thing, right? But we are all trading our time for money, no matter with what we do in life. If it's like work or if it's like hobbies, whatever, it doesn't matter. You are trading your time to earn a living, to have a roof over your head, but at the same time, you have a choice with that. You see what I mean? So like, you can never get time back. You can only decide on how to use your time effectively going forward in the future and also in the present as well. So ask yourself if the time that you're spending on your job is worth the time that you're investing, because it's a two-way road. No matter what they want you to think, in 2024 going forward with employers and employees. It's a two-way road. And that's why there's a big problem right now with at-will employment in the United States. Our European counterparts, I believe, don't have that. Or if they do, it's very rare. But here in the US, what that means, like at-will employment, is they can fire you for no reason. And vice versa. You can quit for no reason. But typically, from the employee side of things, you have to give a 2-week notice and you have to be nice and all that stuff if you don't want to burn bridges for references, which I can cover in another video as well. But it's a two-way street, and never forget that, because they want you to forget that. And at the end of the day, if you are working a job that you don't like and you want to go into another field, you want to do something else, don't quit your job outright, because that is just downright risky and insane. I don't want you being on the street because of some advice that I gave. Find another job at the same time. Keep on working this 9 to 5 that you don't like. Find that 9 to 5 that you like. But just be aware that it's going to take a long time. So get that resume up, update your LinkedIn profile, do a bunch of outreach, do informational interviews, practice your interviewing skills, because that's always important too. And at the same time, just be aware that if you want to find a new job, it's going to take a while. So, all of that to say, like and follow for more career development advice. I don't know why I decided to talk about this stuff now, but I'm facing all of this like myself. Not liking my job. Don't, anyone that's watching this from work, don't get that in your mind, and tell people, because that I'm perfectly content with my job. But it's just like, you think about these things, right? Like, you work a 9 to 5 for your life, and then I've had experience in like the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit world, and freelance. And for people that are just starting out, I remember how confusing it was for me when I graduated college, and I had no idea like where I was applying to. I was like, okay, is the nonprofit world okay? Is the public sector like okay? And I can definitely tell you that all 4 of these sectors and more have pros and cons to them. So just stuff to consider. Like and subscribe for more, with more career development videos and other related things too.